Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Bryan. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
This is the second installment of the two-part series on Modern Manhood, which was filmed live at our Discerning Dick Sexual Wisdom for the Modern Man event here in New York City. Now, if you're one of those weirdos who's listening to part 2 without having listened to part 1, Modern Manhood is the name of the book written by Cleo Stiller, who is an Emmy and Peabody nominated reporter. Modern Manhood tackles conversations about the complicated world of being a good man today. It is an epic book. You need to go out and buy it right now. This episode was filmed in front of a live audience of about 70 men and women, and this was our, 11th such event, and I've got to say, it ranks right up there for both me and Bryan as an all-time favorite because the audience was just lit up to discuss and debate these important issues. So in this episode, we dive deep into the following arenas. Why locker room talk, which is the lowest common denominator of male bonding, unfortunately still serves as an effective method of communication and connection between men, and how we can upgrade that. Why our masculinity is constantly being tested, including a recent example of when one-testicle Bryan, who is a testicular cancer survivor, was told to grow a pair for not having finished his beer. Why men's worst behaviors are tragic expressions of unmet needs, as one of our guests, Shai, so wisely stated. And then finally, an emotional moment for me and for many women in the room where I read a Step 9 apology letter. If you are not familiar with the fact that I was in Sex Addicts Anonymous for a 4-year period of time, that is a 12-step program. The 9th step is where you make amends to those that you had harmed. And so I'd written a letter to a woman who I'd objectified over a 10-year period of time, sexually speaking, and this was my apology letter to her. And I chose to share it, which I'd never shared in any public setting before, in front of this room of 70 men and women as an example of what an apology could look like. And I wasn't prepared for the amount of emotion that it evoked in many of the women in the room who came up to me afterwards and told me what a powerful moment it was to hear what a true heartfelt apology could sound like. And so I offer that up to you as well as something that perhaps you could use as a template for such situations in your life in the future. Enjoy today's episode.
It seems that guys have been taught that communication is an impediment to having sex. It's an impediment to the advancement. If I say anything, I'm going to disrupt this whole thing. She's going to get out of the moment, and then she's going to say no, and I've been waiting for 6 months. And I'm going to miss this one moment, and then everyone's going to make fun of me because the guy who left the party is going to find out I didn't hook up with her, and he's going to make fun of me. How did you miss that? You're a chump. Versus how do we start to see communication as being the gateway? And I'm curious maybe if there are men in the room here who have been taught that the communication is the impediment. What do you think we need to do? What do we need to say to men to actually say, no, it's the opposite. When you're reading books like this, women want to be around you, right? When you are communicating, women do want to be with you. How do we start doing that?
I know I'm preaching to the choir in this crowd, but I think what we're really circling around here is just an inability of both genders to be vulnerable. And communication, yes, for sure. What I keep hearing is this male fear of rejection. And I think it's good for us to look at micro examples of Mitch, but this is kind of not going to make an argument against Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, but it's unless we talk about serious macro changes and systemic changes to the system, there's always going to be a Mitch feeling as though he can't really communicate because he's fearful of rejection. So I'm also wondering if we can maybe zoom out a little bit and talk about how we create societies where men feel they can be vulnerable and won't see a no to sex as some type of indictment on their masculinity. So I do think we need to kind of zoom out if we really, everybody has different theories of change here, but Mitch doesn't exist in a vacuum. So I think we have to I think we really have to talk about macro systemic change and policy change for sure. So I'd be interested in just that's more of kind of an invitation or a request to zoom out a little bit here.
Thanks, Lauren. And Cleo, is there anything that's popping up for you in the book, like stories, examples of, to your specific question, Lauren, about like, how do we make it less societally terrifying to face rejection? To hear no and not to have like the ego bruised. One of the sources that you cite in the book is Tony Porter and the man box.
Yes.
Do you want to spend a minute maybe like bouncing that one around? Because I do think societally, like this man box concept is something that I remember reading it and saying, oh, that is like a macro level thing that we get kind of socialized into very early on.
Sure. So the man box is a concept that's been around since the 70s, and it was originally started by a men's group out in Oakland. And it's just this idea that while we think of society as policing femininity very harshly, we also police masculinity as well. They talk about this concept of a man box where to be a like good man, you have to be strong,
heterosexual, dominant over women, ambitious, no insecurities, no weaknesses.
Exactly. Thank you.
And then you're a man.
Well done. And some men, right? And it's just so basic, but right, let's just say like, obviously there is no central male experience or female experience. So everything happens on a spectrum. But with the man box, some people do fit and identify very well within the man box. And so it doesn't pull at them and they experience their lives like quite easily. But for men who do not, which is really a large portion because the box is rather restrictive and has this standard that's like almost unachievable, this is how you have someone who doesn't feel like rejection is not an indictment on their worth as an individual. And the argument that people who talk about the man box make is that it's just like, fuck the box. Like we as a society, and I'll just say, so just so you know, Lauren, this book honestly is very individually focused because what I want it to do is like, for this, right? I talked to men who felt very disempowered with the conversation that's happening right now. Like they didn't know their role in it. They didn't know if they could say anything. They had really strong feelings. And I wanted to give them context and information that empowered them to think about their own behavior and then make a decision about what's right for them. And that's, again, why there's no blanket rules. But my feeling is if we can work on an individual level and get more comfortable with our own behavior, we will see these shifts start to happen. So that was my response to that.
I love that. I love how you close your statements. That's my response to that. You know, one of the things that ties together what you just shared, and Lauren, your point, I had a chance to go to Esther Perel's Paradox of Masculinity conference last year. So Esther Perel, for those of you who don't know her, she's a brilliant author, brilliant therapist, and she decided to run an event about like what it means to be a man. And one of the things that she said that struck me to my core, and I speak about it in my TEDx talk, she says that masculinity does not seem to be this natural birthright that men are given. We have to go out and earn it and then vigilantly maintain it moment by moment over the course of life's actions. And the way that I paralleled that is like, it feels a lot like how trust works. You know, like you can spend your entire life building trust and you can lose it in an instant because trust is fragile like that. And as it turns out, so is masculinity. Right. So is there anyone in here who's not heard, be a man, suck it up, don't be a pussy? Like these are regular moments of reckoning every single day over the course of our lives that we contend with. We can temporarily lose our masculinity if we don't finish our beer in front of our group of friends. Right. We're a pussy. Happened to Bryan on Friday night, my birthday party. So like I had my best friends from high school that I grew up with since childhood, and they're amazing. They're like wonderful human beings. They just haven't started this work yet. And there's the one guy in the group, you know what I mean? Like there's the one guy in the group. He's the guy who like you start telling a story about a woman, it's like 3 seconds into the story. Did you bang her? That's all he cares about, right? It's like the did you bang her guy. Almost every guy has a group of guys and there's this guy in the group. And so Bryan comes in. He's got to leave, you know, after like 2 hours or something, like after being there for 2 hours, but he was the first one to leave. He stands up. oh, you're a pussy, sit down, have a beer. And it's just like, we laugh because it's almost like you just knew it was going to happen.
He said, grow a pair, which for a guy with one nut.
Oh, that was great. He's got one nut, right?
Took a lot of offense. Yeah.
I turned to him, I was like, grow one more.
Right. Would have been more accurate.
And he was horrified.
Yeah.
Like, that was the thing that
he
horrified.
actually felt bad then, yeah.
Yeah, which was great. Shamed him a little bit. Yeah. So, but do you see this? Like, it is so invasive, and you don't like. So we constantly have our sword and our shield up, and that's why some of these rejections can feel really horrible. And when we don't learn how to deal with it, the reverberating effect that comes back at the person who said no can sometimes be pretty ugly.
The reason being for that is because men don't have the luxury as women do to express feelings, to talk about it, to sit around with other men and just talk about it. Because you said, sometimes in a situation like this, some men will feel out of place. Like, well, I don't know, what should I say? Should I interject on this question? Maybe this is a woman's topic. Do I even have an opinion on this? So when it comes to men and expressing feelings, we just need to establish you can have that luxury. Like, you have that luxury to cry. You have that luxury to express your sexuality however you feel, because men can express that sexuality. Because if you do, your woman that you might like will look at you differently if you tell her you're bi. You know what I'm saying? So then you limit your chances with, who knows, the girl that you like for 6 months, Mitch, right? Something like that. So,
hey, thank you for sharing that, my friend. I have a few things I'd like to say, but Cleo, it sounded like you were having a reaction.
Well, yeah, sorry. So quickly on that, for me, one of the most interesting chapters, and I thought it was going to be like a sleeper chapter, was the friendship chapter. I would not have thought to have included it, except that I heard over and over again, I've got a dude in my friend group. He's that guy, and he always says some shit that's like inappropriate, racist, sexist. And we used to kind of laugh it off, but now it doesn't feel like that's okay anymore. How do I call him out without losing the friend or having him turn it around on me and be like, what, are you perfect? And this came up a lot. And so the question that underlies that then, right, is like, well, why does that guy talk like that? Why do men do locker room talk? And what it turns out is the reason men do locker room talk is because that's how they bond. That is the one way that we've taught men that they can communicate with each other. And I talked to one researcher who's been studying male adolescence for 30 years. Her name is Niobe Way. And she tells me this story about how, well, it's just research. If you look at young boys and young girls when they're quite young, they have friends the exact same way. Like, they love them, they kiss them, they're super close, they rely on them emotionally, share a lot of secrets. And then these little boys quite early get told, don't hug your friend like that, don't touch your friend like that, don't kiss your friend, don't need your friend. You don't need friend, like, you're on your own. That's a girl thing. Like, don't be weak. And so to have that instilled on you on such an early age, then we see men often, they don't have these very intimate emotional discussions with their friends. And Niobe talks about how she does this sort of like trial every year where she checks in with the incoming class as their freshmen going into high school. And she'll be like, who's your best friend? And the guy can always point to his best friend. What do you guys talk about? They share a lot of things. And she checks in with them every year, sophomore year, junior year. And by the time they get to senior year, always that really close best friend, now they're just kind of like, they're just checking in. They're doing locker room talk. Who did you hook up with? Blah, blah, blah. Very surface level. And so I really feel you on this. And I didn't know that as a woman. And so the kind of isolation or surface level, like when guys are like, don't take that locker room talk away from me. Like, that's how we communicate. That's kind of their reaction there.
Can I ask your name, my friend? Shamar. Thank you for sharing that. And as you were speaking, like, my heart was starting to hurt for you as you were talking about how women own the exclusive rights to show emotion, right? And if you've ever showed emotion in your life, then there's some sort of backlash, or maybe like there's affection that's been withheld from you.
I'm actually just nervous when I speak in public.
So everything you said, you have no idea what you just said? But I actually saw quite a bit of reaction in the room as you were speaking about that's not necessarily true. And what I'm not saying is that that's not true in your experience. If that's your experience, that's your experience. That's why I felt like pain for you, because I know what it's like to have felt that way for sure. One of the things I didn't share tonight, but I've shared very publicly in previous events like these and on the podcast, is I spent 4 years in Sex Addicts Anonymous recovery from 2013 to 2017. And I was a very sensitive kid. Like, I felt things really, really deep and really powerfully. I didn't know how to express them because I wasn't allowed to. Like, I could show anger, but other than that, like showing weakness or crying, like that's not what a man does or a boy does, right? So I still felt the feelings. I had no idea. I had no outlet for it. But then I discovered masturbation, which became this, kind of like, say to Bryan, it was like this like heroin for free that I could pull on this crank anytime and just all my problems would go away. And that became anytime I felt overwhelmed or nervous or anxious or any kind of feeling that didn't feel good, I didn't know how to process it healthy. So I would just go to my bedroom and crank one out. And then as I became older and I started interacting with real women, then it became that. And then it escalated. And then it just became my way of existing. I had no idea that it was like I had a separate life. A public-facing Dominic that was, very well respected in the financial services industry, that was a leader of people. Then I had this private Dominic who was just numbing out all my feelings and emotions because that's the only way I thought I would be welcomed. If I showed anything else, then I thought I'd be rejected. And it was only when I hit my bottom and I went in and I had to confront this. What's coming to me, man, is the very first time I realized I could actually show emotion was when I walked into my first 12-step meeting for Sex Addicts Anonymous recovery. And it was surreal, right? Like I entered this room of guys and just like the movies, hi, I'm Dominic. I'm a sex addict. What the fuck am I doing here? And what I came to learn was that this was the first group of men that I'd ever been a part of, ever, that weren't trying to compete with me. Every other group of men that I ever walked into a circle with, it was like, who's the alpha dog? Who's the guy that I can dominate? Where's my biggest threat? Like trying to size up every single situation. It's like this like hyper algorithm in my head. And then this group of men wanted to actually hear my story. They wanted to comfort me. They wanted to like be there for me. They allowed me to show emotion. And it took a while for the emotion to come because I'd beaten it down for so long. And so since 2013, like my reality's been very different than that, man. Like I've found guys like Bryan and our men's group and other groups of men who are doing this inner work, where Vincenzo, I met at the Mankind Project 4 or 5 years ago, and he's deep into inner work and he's a lovely human being. And like, we can talk about anything and everything. And once I was able to recognize that that's accepted, then the women in my life who I was pulling in not only accept it, they fucking love that. They embrace that. They show me the way. So that's my opinion about that. I feel better. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
I'm not going to say much I'm going to agree with a lot that has been said already, but I'm a father of 2 kids. One's a 5-year-old boy. We were having a Halloween thing in our town. We live in Pleasantville, and it's everything you can think it is, okay? Everybody knows who I am, and it's not because I'm the nice guy. It's because I'm the only brown guy in town. So I'm there, and we're painting. We get to paint windows at Halloween time, and my son's having a total meltdown. And this sweet little Italian lady who goes to church, I see her all the time. She's walking down the street. She sees my son having a meltdown crying. She goes, oh, boys don't cry. Boys don't cry. And right away, I run to his defense. He's already in my lap, and I'm just like, boys do cry. It's okay that boys cry, and it's good that he cries. And so she backed off, and thank you. So then I take him to the library I go on a trip with his class. We go to the library. The librarian's talking, and she's saying, when you come here with your mommies, and I go, and your daddies, because this is the point I'm trying to make. You were saying before, like making this macro change. And there are a lot of young people here who may choose to have children one day. And it's somewhat on you to bring that message. Don't let the librarian say only mommies, because then the boy and the girls hear only mommy. They only see mommy. So what if it's only mommy? But daddy can come on the weekends. Hold daddy responsible. Hold daddy to the fire, right? Like it's on all of us to do this. And that's why I teach meditation at my kids' elementary school, because they need to see a man doing this stuff. They need to know that this stuff's okay, right? So it's on all of us to do that. So I just want to make sure that I say that to everybody.
Cheers. Thank you. Yeah, Leah.
So in thinking about what everyone is...
Also featured in the book is...
Parenting parenting chapter.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm just so riveted by everyone's sharing. And I was thinking, I'm curious about the women. I don't know about you, but for me, if I'm being approached by a man and that energy has a sincere and direct expression of desires, sincere and direct, you know what you want, and it's from the heart, with an unequivocal detachment from outcome to what they want. That is the greatest turn on to me as a woman. It almost will flip the switch to a situation where I may have been a no. I'm not saying do that to make her a yes. Don't do that with that purpose. But you'd be amazed that when that sincerity and directness comes through, it's that showing cards. You're showing this delicate part of you. And if you're a no, I think there's a real grace that women can learn to deliver rejection as well. It happened to me this summer. Someone expressed a deep affinity and desires, and my heart was so warmed by that expression. I made it clear I wasn't interested and it wasn't reciprocated, but it was so beautiful to share that with me. And of course, I had to embrace that. And I think not seeing it always as an attack on us could be a really valuable step for women as well. And I'm curious if the women agree.
You know, Bryan, I remember one of the things that you said, and Monica Yates is a wonderful coach for women, ran an event here in the city called Feminine as Fuck, right? Where for 3 days brought a group of women together to get back into their bodies and to get back to their feminine essence. And we were fortunate enough to be brought in. One of the things that you've learned about women opening up to men approaching them. The start of the approach actually doesn't happen often with men. It's most often with women. And how does that happen?
I believe this was from Helen Fisher as well, Dr. Helen Fisher. She did a study on who makes the first move. And they found out about 80% of the cases, it's the woman that makes the first move. And the first move isn't, hi, my name is, but the first move is a glance. The first move is turning the body a certain way. And so part of what we talk about with women is just how do we do that? And then 2 is how do guys start to pick up on it? Because there's going to be a lot lost in translation, right, with what's going on. So.
Yeah, because it's a terrifying thing to approach and to face rejection, especially if you're doing it in front of a group of guys. I mean, I've been rejected in front of a group of guys. It's bad to get the no. Then you got to go back to your group of friends, which is even worse.
Because you're not good enough.
They're never saying, hey, you tried. Good job, buddy.
You will be single forever.
Yeah, it's not that at all. Okay. I want to give some time to this next question because I think this is a really important one. What do you do if you have gray areas in your past? And Cleo, I know this is something that came up quite a bit in the book also, right? Men who had feared, I have something in the past, and what do I do with that? So where would you begin even answering this question?
So I would share that I did hear from several men who I interviewed that everything that's happening right now, whether it was something about the Aziz Ansari story or the Kavanaugh hearing, had really gotten home for them. And they'd been like, oh no, I did that. I've got that. And they apologized. These are incidents that came 10 years earlier. So for example, right, there was one person I interviewed who told me he worked in news. So he was based in LA and was covering the Kavanaugh hearing for his job. And so really in it and hating what he was hearing and judging this man. And then it occurred to him. He also went to Yale undergrad. And as he reported to me, school was really hard for him because he was quite young. He went when he was 16 and he was first generation Mexican and really just felt very isolated at Yale. And he drank a lot to cover his pain. And there was a woman there that he would only hook up with when he was very drunk, and he knew he treated her badly. And he kind of wrestled with this, I really want to apologize because I'm judging Kavanaugh right now, and I've got this in my past, this is just it's not sinking, right? But then had this fear but if I apologize, it's going to have to be over an email, and then there's a paper trail, and then what if she leaks it on social, which is just the realist, right? Maybe you want to apologize, but the stakes are high, and so what do? Well, he apologized. He reached out to her on Facebook. They hadn't spoken in years. And according to him, she, of course, not expecting this apology at all, and very, very, very grateful. And this also came up a lot in the interviews, like this feeling of like, okay, enough complaining, enough airing our grievances. Like, I get it. It's bad. What can we do to move forward? Like, what's the course of action? I want to be not uncomfortable anymore. Is there a case of redemption? Like, is there anyone you can point to whose lives haven't been completely fucked? And there was this one example that came up through people that I interviewed. There was a podcast called The Harmon Town. It's Dan Harmon is a executive producer and pretty well known in Hollywood. And he had tweeted, "Fuck Harvey Weinstein" or something. And then someone had hopped on his tweet and was like, well, that's really the pot calling the kettle black. And he knew that woman. And he was like, oh shit. And then he got on his podcast and he told the story of what had happened with this woman. He had been running the show Community, the one with Chevy Chase. And he was the EP on that show. And he had a young female writer on staff. He crushed on her big time and let everyone know about it and would just like put all of her jokes into the script, would really hit on her big time. And she was like, can you please stop? You're making it super awkward for me and everyone in the group. Like, please stop. And he would not stop. He was living with another woman. Like, he was her boss. It was just like not good news, right? And then finally, like, he got pissed at her that she wouldn't go out with him. And so then he started treating her like shit. And he tells this story on the podcast and he's like, I know that this is one of the more gray areas in this whole conversation, but I know that the way I thought of her at that time was like not as a human and my employee who I should be nurturing their talents, but I was just sexualizing her and I just wanted her and she wouldn't give me what I wanted. So I tried to make her life miserable. And her friends were like, girl, you need to go listen to the Harmon podcast. And This American Life did an episode on this. This is how I know about it. But she said, I cannot tell you how validating it was to have the one person who could say what I knew had happened did happen and how much that changed things for me. He is the only one who has the power to validate your experience in that way. And that is why apologies go so far for the people who you've hurt. And so what I'd offer to people when you're thinking like, do I have some gray areas in the past? It's not my business to tell you whether or not you apologize or not, but you might want to really think about that situation. Why did you do that? Like, what was underlying that behavior? What was underlying that scenario? Get really clear about that. Was it insecurity you were covering up? Was it like, fuck it, I need to score. Like, I don't want to hear a no. Get really clear on that and do not do it again. Do not do it again. I think you should also apologize. It will be received with grace, most likely. But if it doesn't, also, that's okay. That's not on you. But get really clear, because what I heard over and over again, right? The fear of like, I don't know how to exist right now. Like, it's so confusing. If you get really clear on the motivations of your own behavior, it's so empowering because then you can be quite sure you're probably not going to hurt someone in the future. And if you do, fuck it. Like, say you're sorry, right? Say you're sorry. Listen to why your behavior hurt them and don't do it again.
I have some real life experience with this. So if anyone's familiar with the 12-step recovery program, there's a step called Step 9. And Step 9 is making amends to those that you have harmed along your journey. And so back in 2015, what I did was I wrote down an entire list of women that I felt like I didn't treat very well because I was just using them sexually or obsessing over them sexually, trying to get my needs met. And there's some things that I really want to share with the men in this room if you're thinking about going out and making some of these apologies, because in listening to that story, it was like textbook. But one of the things that starts to bubble up for us, or bubbled up for me, was I felt so bad about what I'd done that I needed her apology. Like I need to apologize. I needed her to accept my apology, which is even more unfair. I'm adding more shit now. That now becomes her burden, her responsibility. And fortunately, one of the things that I had in my recovery program was a brilliant sponsor. So one of the things that he coached me on was, when you are reaching out to make an apology, it is purely to apologize to her, is to validate her experience. And I actually brought one of my letters that I wrote to someone, and I'm going to read you a passage from it just so you can hear it. And I'm feeling pretty raw about sharing it, but like making sure that the apology was for her, not for me to feel like I had some weight lifted off my chest, because then that would have just again been an exacerbation of the problem. One of the things that I found when I sent out these letters, and I actually wrote them, I typed them, so they're out there in the internet. They could come back at any point in time. If I'd sent out 20 different letters, I was shocked how many women came back to me and said, I don't even know what you're talking about. And what I mean by that is, like, what made me sad about that was, like, what they have come to receive from men in terms of, like, behavior had become so, like, mine was so normalized that, like, me apologizing for it was kind of like, what are you talking about? And that started to break my heart. The letter I wanted to read to you was to a woman who I had probably like on and off 10 years worth of sexual relations with, when I met her in my early 20s, and then we just kind of went back and forth for a while. And Cleo gave me the, what do you call those? The in-Q, out-Q? I'm not going to read you the whole letter. In-Q, out-Q. So I wrote to her and I said, I hope this note finds you well. I did not treat you with the respect that you deserved. This holds true throughout the entirety of the time I've known you, now spanning a decade. From the very beginning, I objectified and sexualized you through countless fantasy scenarios, starting online and then over the phone and in person. I did this obsessively, consuming countless hours of your time without respect for your time or energy. I also never truly contemplated how repeated treatment of this kind might impact you. When you found yourself getting frustrated and angry with me, you weren't crazy. I was constantly trying to extract from you all the things sexual that I wanted when I wanted them. I had blinders on and wouldn't be stopped. When you found me distant after our in-person sexual interactions, you weren't crazy. I was distant. I'd gotten what I'd wanted, and the high was gone. My worst character defects were on display throughout my interactions with you. One of the things I put here, I'm not sure as to how I can make up for the harm I have done. However, what I can offer is a genuine promise that I will do my utmost never to put anyone, including myself, through something like that again. Please understand that I'm not seeking to establish any type of romantic or sexual relationship with this outreach. But should you ever want to talk about any of this, I would welcome a conversation. And if I can be of any service to you in any way, please let me know. And she wrote me a beautiful response. I don't have her permission to share with you, but all I can say is I was, like you had mentioned, Cleo, like of all the messages that I'd reached out and I'd sent to, I was shocked at how warmly I was received. And I think it was because like I had proper coaching from someone who had written his own letters, who made sure that the onus was like focused on owning everything, making sure the apology was for her, and not putting any burden on her to need to forgive me.
And I think one more thing, Dom, on this forgiveness factor. I think for guys, right, we're not talking about the 10%, the lower 10%. We're talking about these gray zones. And I know for myself, and I know a lot of other guys, who they have to forgive themselves. We were growing up. We learned to live in the man box, and we did it well. We have to get to a point where we can say my consciousness, my understanding, my learnings over these past years, and Me Too was a huge accelerator in that, has brought me to a different level. And I realize now something I didn't realize before. And for that, I'm sorry. And that's okay. And for the women in the room, you don't have to forgive everything. There's some things that are really unforgivable. But I will say, when we do reach that level of forgiveness and we can get there, healing happens not only on the guy's side, but I can promise you it happens on your side too. I believe, like Cleo, the reason in part you wrote this book was to find that pivot point between men and women and how we're making this whole thing happen. And I think that forgiveness element is a huge one on both sides, both self and others. So, beautiful.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions of Cleo. I would love, if you have a question for Cleo, I'd love to give you the floor.
Can I try a comment with a question?
Sure.
So I'm just so much going through my mind tonight, and I want to try to touch on what Lauren said and the beginning. So I want to posit that there are no bad guys. I want to posit that everything we've discussed tonight are just tragic expressions of unmet needs, and that there's an epidemic that nobody's talking about of loneliness for men. Real loneliness that some of us don't even know about. And even if it's not loneliness, it's a lack of quality of love and connection and affection and nurture that starts when you're like 6 years old and goes into your teens. And nobody's touching you, nobody's holding you, nobody's cuddling you, nothing. And that epidemic, that is like a root disease of all these other symptoms. And I wonder why we're not talking about that like on a systemic level of like men are suffering, so are women. As a part of this, it's a spiral. Like, so that's my question. Like, we're talking a lot about all these stories, and they're amazing stories of apologies and everything, but isn't there a disease at the root of it all? And I'm just inviting everybody to, like, I'm asking, what do you think about that, Cleo?
People ask me what was the most surprising part of reporting this book, and as a woman, the most surprising part was how much pain is out there. I feel tremendously for men now in a way that I had not before. And that saying, hurt people, came to my mind over and over again. To your point about this conversation we're not having, GQ's issue out this quarter is The New Masculinity. The Hidden Brain just did an episode called The Lonely Man. The American Psychological Association just this year called typical masculinity unhealthy. You know, and that pisses off a bunch of people in this country. It doesn't ring true maybe for everyone, but I so hear you there. And it is completely an unexpected observation from reporting this book. I did not expect that. And I cried a lot in interviews. I never, ever cry in interviews. So I'm with you there. And what I will say is I have more hope also after reporting this book, because I see the pain and I see the desire for bringing down the walls and the isolation and the loneliness. And I also see that a lot of people are starting to talk about it. This is starting to be a conversation that not just intellectual circles in New York City are having. Where I kind of leave Modern Manhood, the book, is, of course, you know, someone who grows up in the rural South is going to have a really different reaction to the stories that are told than someone who grows up in Indiana versus South LA, right? So it gets interpreted on an individual level. But where I land on this question of like, what is a good man today? And what is a good woman today? It's less, what does a good man do? And more, what does a good human do? And I think if we think about our behavior less in terms of like this, you know, the binary, which is a buzzword now, but really, if we think about it less in gendered terms, like this question of chivalry and like, do you hold the door open for a woman anymore? Or are you offending them because then they'll think that they're weak? Don't hold the door open because the person behind you has a vagina or a penis or whatever. Hold the door for the person coming behind you because that's a good thing to do. It's a good human thing to do. And if you don't want to hold the door for the person behind you, fucking don't do it, you know? And so really that's kind of like where I'm leaving this book and the, you know, the questions of worry less about being like a strong man or a feminine woman and get really clear on like what kind of good human behavior do you want to have?
Yeah, the way I define that is if we have the man box, it's like define your own box. Like, what do you want to be in your box? And is that okay? And Shai, to your point of what is this epidemic, forget good guy, bad guy stuff. I look at my father, who I love, respect, learn so much goodness from, and I see some of his friendships and relationships, and I look at myself 30, 40 years down the road, and like, I don't want those types of relationships in my life. I want a deeper connection. And so it's not because my dad's a bad guy. But it's something, there is something in this that allows us to connect at a completely different level. And so that's what I'm after. When I'm like, hey, are you a good guy? Are you a bad guy? Do you need to do the work? Do you not need to do the work? It's like, well, where were your models at? And do you want something different? That's the only real question that we have to ask. And if you want something different, then define it. Define the box that you want to be your masculinity, whatever it is. And by the way, like nothing hotter than that, than a guy that's totally different out there and owns it. Like that's...
Turns you on?
Turns me on.
Yeah.
Turns me on.
So I think this might be a great place to wrap things up. What I want to do is I want to make sure that everyone here gets themselves a copy of Modern Manhood. And I know that we have some up here and Cleo has some in a bag behind her. So please come up afterwards. I think they're $20 a pop? Yeah. So please get a copy for yourself. Get a copy for someone that you care about, a man that needs to read it or a woman who needs to read it, because this is like required reading, I believe, for everybody. Cleo, to leave us with one last maybe piece of either guidance or wisdom that you would have for, let's just say Bryan and I, as we're continuing to go out and do this work, as we're fortunate enough to be entrusted with 2 hours of all of your evenings plus your commute time to come here and hear something, this profound. How can Bryan and I continue to level up and be better and champion some of the work that you're putting out there?
Well, that thought that I just left you with, like, that's my crescendo. But I would also say, listen, because people really want to talk right now. And like I said, right, I was shocked at the stories people told me. I'm like, this is going in the book, right? People are hungry for it. They want to be heard, to your point about isolation, right? So listen.
Beautiful. Can we please have a round of applause for Cleo?
Hey, if you dug this episode, how about dropping us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts? It'll take you no more than a few seconds, and every rating helps us to build credibility with potential new listeners. And the more listeners we have, the more amazing guests that we can attract and bring on the show for you. So head over to Apple Podcasts, drop us a rating and review, and by the way, thank you.